We pull back the heavy curtain of history to reveal a secret so well kept, it was almost erased forever. What if I told you that in the heart of the so-called Dark Ages, some of the wealthiest, most powerful, and happiest people in Europe were women who made a deliberate, strategic choice to live without men? I'm not talking about lonely spinsters or tragic widows. I'm talking about brilliant entrepreneurs, visionary community builders, and savvy political players who looked at the institution of marriage and said they chose to build empires instead. But their success was so profound, so threatening to the established order, that medieval society mobilized to write them out of history books. Their stories were buried in dusty archives, hidden in coded ledgers and silenced by centuries of propaganda. We bring them back into the light. These are the women who would make today's top CEOs look like interns. Before we journey back 700 years, if you believe that history is full of unsung heroes and forgotten revolutionaries, then you're in the right place. Consider joining our community of history detectives by hitting that subscribe button. Your support helps us dig deeper and bring more of these incredible lost stories to life. Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one, and hearing from you is the best part of this journey. Now let's dim the lights. We're traveling to a world where women didn't just break the rules. Picture the bustling heart of 13th century London. The air is thick with the smell of spices, leather, and ambition. In the crowded Cheapside market, the most prosperous stall isn't run by a burly guildmaster. It's operated by a woman with a mind as sharp as a needle named Marjorie de Clare. Marjorie owns 3 shops and 2 houses and has just brokered a deal on French wine worth more than a nobleman's entire annual income. And here's the most astonishing part. Marjorie was single by choice. Court records from the era describe her as living her most excellent life. That's a direct quote from a 700-year-old legal document. Marjorie was an anomaly. She was part of a powerful, unspoken sisterhood. City records from London reveal a staggering statistic. 23% of all property-owning merchants were unmarried women. Nearly 1 in 4 successful businesses were run by women who chose independence over a husband. How is this possible? These women had a unique legal status known as femme sole, which literally translates to woman alone. In an age when a married woman, a femme covert, was legally invisible, her identity, property, and earnings completely absorbed by her husband, the femme sole was a force to be reckoned with. She could own land, sign contracts, run a business, and even sue people in court. She had rights that married women could only dream of. It was a recognized status, and these women used it to build fortunes. Take Agnes Sampson from 14th century York. Agnes was the medieval equivalent of a venture capitalist. She built a textile empire that spanned 3 countries and employed over 200 people. In one of her business letters, which miraculously survived, she wrote to a partner who suggested she marry for influence. "I'd rather kiss a plague rat. My gold stays in my purse." But don't imagine these women were lonely workaholics. Their diaries and letters paint a picture of lives rich with friendship, travel, and intellectual pursuits. They hosted lavish dinner parties, commissioned art, and funded scholars. Isabella de Fortibus, an immensely wealthy widow who owned vast estates, wrote in her diary, "I wake each day grateful that my choices are mine alone." Her days were spent managing her properties, her afternoons studying with tutors, entertaining friends with music and storytelling. So if these women were so successful and content, why have most of us never heard of them? This is where the story takes a dark turn. As the economic power and visibility of these independent women grew, medieval society began to panic. Their very existence was a threat. How dare they prove that a woman's happiness and prosperity weren't dependent on a man? The backlash was deliberate and brutal. Church leaders started preaching that an unmarried woman was an affront to God's natural order. Legal scholars wrote lengthy arguments claiming that women living alone were a danger to social stability. The language itself was weaponized. The word spinster, which originally just meant a woman who spins wool for a living, was gradually twisted into a term of pity and scorn. Society was actively rewriting the narrative to make female independence seem tragic and unnatural. But what I find most incredible is that these women saw the manipulation for what it was. In a letter dated 1342, a merchant named Eleanor de Montfort wrote to her niece, "They call us unnatural because we threaten their natural order, that a woman's worth isn't measured by the man beside her, but by the life she builds with her own hands." These medieval pioneers understood something that modern psychology is only now catching up with. Authentic happiness comes from living a life aligned with your own values. not society's expectations. They knew that being alone didn't have to mean being lonely, and that choosing yourself wasn't a consolation prize. It was often the grand prize. They formed powerful networks, creating what historians now call chosen families, communities of women who supported each other in business, illness, and old age. This was just the beginning. Our journey next takes us to the misty lowlands of medieval Belgium, where a group of extraordinary women took this idea of independence and turned it into a full-blown revolution. They didn't just succeed within society. They created an entirely new one. What they built would change everything. Welcome to 13th century. In the heart of bustling cities like Bruges and Ghent, you would find something remarkable, a serene, walled community that looked like a village within the city. This was a beguinage, and the women who lived here, the Beguines, were living a life so far ahead of their time. It's hard to believe it was real. While the rest of Europe was still debating whether women even had souls, the Beguines had created what were, in essence, the world's first feminist communes. These women were not nuns bound by lifelong vows, and they certainly weren't wives. They were something entirely new. Independent women who had invented the concept of having it all 700 years before the phrase was coined. And this wasn't some fringe movement. By the year 1320, there were over 200,000 Beguines across northern Europe. That's a population larger than most medieval cities. They had created a massive parallel society where women lived, worked, and thrived completely outside the control of traditional marriage or the strict rules of a convent. A Beguine took temporary vows of chastity and obedience. But here was a revolutionary part. She could leave at any time. She could reclaim her property, and even get married if she chose. The beguinage offered a life of purpose and community, without demanding the sacrifice of personal freedom. Let me tell you about Margaret Porete, a French beguine from the 1250s who was so brilliant at a time when most people were illiterate. Margaret wrote a profound philosophical. It explored concepts of spiritual freedom and a direct connection to God that were so radical, so threatening to the church's authority, that they burned her at the stake as a heretic. But they couldn't burn her ideas. Copied in secret, influencing thinkers for centuries. The genius of the Beguine system was its structure. Each beguinage was self-sufficient. It was a safe haven where women could live, work productively, and age with dignity, without ever needing a man's protection or permission. And their business model was pure brilliance. The Beguines became a dominant force in the textile industry. They controlled entire supply chains. Historical records from a Bruges city archive show that by 1300, Beguine workshops produced an astonishing 60% of all the fine cloth exported from a region. These women weren't just participating in the economy. They solved problems we still struggle with today. Work-life balance. They created flexible schedules that blended productive labor with spiritual contemplation and study. Retirement security. They established mutual aid funds where younger Beguines cared for the elderly, ensuring no one was left destitute. They built beautiful, sustainable communities that have lasted for centuries. Many beguinages are now UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Marie Doignes, one of the movement's founders, wrote in her journals about the great freedom of Beguine life. She describes waking each morning knowing her day belonged to her. No husband to serve, no children to chase, no male relatives to obey. Her writings radiate a sense of joy and purpose that was almost unheard of for medieval women. The economic impact of the Beguines was so significant that when King Philip IV of France tried to suppress them in 1312, textile markets nearly collapsed. Guild records from Ghent show that within months of suppression attempts, cloth production dropped by 40%. The king was quickly forced to reverse his policy. It turned out you couldn't just get rid of the economic backbone of your kingdom because you were uncomfortable with successful women. The Beguines had found the perfect sweet spot. They were too economically useful to crush, too pious to be easily condemned, and too well-organized to control. They had created a revolutionary life for themselves while navigating the treacherous waters of medieval misogyny. Their letters speak of deep friendships, intellectual challenges, and what they repeatedly called the joy of belonging to ourselves. And here's something that will give you chills. Medical historians believe Beguines lived exceptionally long lives for the period, many reaching their 80s and 90s. Their lower stress levels, strong community support, financial security, and freedom from the immense dangers of repeated childbirth contributed to their remarkable longevity. They weren't just living better. They were literally living longer because of their choices. But not all powerful medieval women needed to create an alternative society. Some found power within the existing one. Through a path that was often paved with grief, we enter the opulent world of medieval commerce and politics, where women who lost their husbands didn't retreat into mourning. They stepped into power. Step into 14th century Venice, a city of shimmering canals and cutthroat politics. Behind the silk curtains of grand palazzos, some of the most powerful people in Europe are making decisions that will shape empires. And many of them are widows. Widowhood could be the ultimate power-up for a woman. Inheritance laws across much of the continent stipulated that when a husband died, his widow automatically gained control of 1/3 to 1/2 of his entire estate. This wasn't just money and businesses, trade networks, and most importantly, complete legal independence. Meet Caterina Cornero, a Venetian noblewoman who didn't just inherit fortune, she inherited a kingdom. After the death of her husband, the King of Cyprus, in 1473, Caterina didn't retreat. She seized the crown. For 15 years, she ruled Cyprus with such skill that Venetian records describe her as more capable than 10 men. And when she finally abdicated, it wasn't because she was forced out. She negotiated a deal so lucrative that it made her one of the wealthiest individuals in all Europe, returning to Venice to preside over a glittering court of artists and thinkers. The Venetian state archives reveal that by the year 1400, widows controlled an estimated 35% of all privately held wealth in the city. These women weren't passive custodians of their late husbands' fortunes. They were active investors, expanding their empires and wielding political influence that made powerful men tremble. Let me tell you about Alessandra Strozzi, a 15th century Florentine widow, leaving her with 5 children and massive debts. Everyone expected her to remarry quickly or face ruin. Alessandra took over the family banking business and transformed it into one of Florence's most profitable enterprises. Her surviving letters reveal a woman who was a master of corporate strategy. She was trading currencies across Europe, arranging strategic marriages for her children to create political alliances, and lending money to nobles who desperately needed her backing. These widow bosses understood leverage in a way that would make a modern CEO jealous. Take Margherita Tini of 14th century Prato. Her merchant husband, Francesco, left her his entire international trading network, stretching from London to Constantinople. Instead of selling it off, records show that under her leadership, the Datini company's profits increased by an astonishing 60% within 3 years. They wielded immense soft power. They couldn't hold formal political office, but they hosted elaborate dinners where trade deals were sealed. They used their immense wealth to fund political causes that advanced their interests. The English royal records tell of Joan of Kent, widow of the Black Prince, who essentially ran England's foreign policy during the childhood of her son, King Richard II. Foreign ambassadors knew that if you wanted a decision made, you had to go through Joan first. And here's something that truly astounds. These powerful widows often chose to remain unmarried, even when they had countless suitors, including kings, because remarriage meant giving up their hard-won power. Under medieval law, everything a widow owned would automatically transfer to her new husband. They looked at their options, surrender power for companionship, or maintain their autonomy and rule their own destinies. Isabella de Fortibus, whom we met earlier, turned down marriage proposals from 3 different kings. Her written response to the final suitor is legendary. I have tasted the sweet wine of independence, and find I have no appetite for the bitter bread of subjugation, regardless of how golden the plate upon which it is served. The economic impact of these wealthy widows was staggering. Tax records show they were among the largest contributors to the royal treasury. They funded crusades, bankrolled the construction cathedrals, and financed voyages of exploration. When King Edward III needed money for his wars in France, he didn't go to the Italian bankers. He went to the wealthy widows of London. But perhaps the most remarkable thing they did was use their wealth to support other women. They established dowry funds for poor girls, created business opportunities for other widows, and built networks of female economic empowerment. They revolutionized philanthropy, funding education and health care. A Florentine widow established the first known scholarship fund specifically for girls' education in 1456. Her endowment contract states that education is the greatest gift one can give to ensure a woman's independence. These women operated in a world that officially considered them inferior, yet they wielded power that most men could only dream of. They proved that with access to resources and freedom from male control, women could not only compete, but dominate. But while these aristocratic widows inherited their power, another group of women was building from the ground up, deal by brilliant deal. Next, we meet the original self-made women, the guild mistresses and innovators whose business empires would make today's startup founders look like amateurs. The year is 1393. In the town of Norfolk, England, a woman named Marjorie Kemp is about to become one of the wealthiest self-made entrepreneurs of the Middle Ages. And she did it all without a business degree, a male mentor, or even the ability to read her own contracts. Marjorie started with nothing but a failed first business and a burning desire to never depend on anyone again. She launched a brewery with borrowed money and sheer grit. Within 5 years, her ale was so renowned that she was supplying taverns across 3 counties. But she didn't stop there. She diversified into grain trading, started a pilgrimage travel business, and eventually became a medieval venture capitalist, funding other women's startups. By 1420, her enterprises employed over 300 people and generated revenues equivalent to millions of dollars today. She was completely illiterate. She conducted all of her business through verbal contracts, a powerful memory, and what her contemporaries called a supernatural gift for mathematics. You might think Marjorie was a one-in-a-million genius, but medieval guild records tell a different story. Unmarried businesswomen were everywhere, and they were dominating entire industries. In 14th century Paris, women held leadership positions in over 100 different guilds, from silk weaving to goldsmithing to beer brewing. Meet Rose of Burford, the medieval equivalent of a tech disruptor. In 1340s England, she completely revolutionized the wool trade. She cut out the male middlemen and began dealing directly with buyers in Flanders. Her great innovation was creating the first known example of international quality certification. She personally guaranteed the grade of her wool. Merchants in Bruges would pay premium prices just for the rose seal of approval. These women weren't just successful as individuals. They created powerful support networks. The London Guild records from 1378 document something called the Sisterhood of Commerce. This was an informal association of female merchants who shared market intelligence, provided each other with emergency loans, and collectively negotiated better prices with suppliers. Modern business schools call this strategic networking. These women were doing it 600 years ago. Their ingenuity was breathtaking. A 12th century merchant named Matilda of Scotland is believed to have invented the first installment payment system for luxury goods. Unable to compete with male merchants on upfront prices, she allowed wealthy customers to pay for silks and spices over time. This innovation spread across Europe and laid the groundwork for modern consumer credit. They also used negotiation tactics that would be at home in any modern boardroom. When male competitors tried to undercut the prices of Denise Lacordaire, a 14th century Parisian rope manufacturer, she didn't start a price war. She cornered the market on the highest quality hemp, forcing her rivals to use inferior materials. She launched a medieval branding campaign, emphasizing superior durability and safety of her ropes. Within 2 years, she had eliminated half her competition and doubled her profit margins. The scale of women's participation in medieval commerce is shocking. York City records from 1415 show that women owned 23% of all commercial properties in the city center. In medieval Cologne, the Brewers Guild was actually dominated by women, who controlled 78% of the city's beer production. Every obstacle became an opportunity. They couldn't join most male-dominated guilds, so they created their own professional organizations. They couldn't easily access traditional banking, so they created informal credit systems among themselves. A letter from a merchant named Isabella Lemerrier to her business partner in 1389 perfectly captures their mindset. The men may have their guilds and their laws, but we have our wits and our will. I would rather build my own ladder than wait for them to lower theirs. Their financial independence was revolutionary. It allowed them to travel, to live where they chose, and most importantly, to say no to marriage proposals from men who might try to control their businesses. But for all their success, they were operating in a society that was fundamentally suspicious of their achievements. Their very success challenged the core beliefs about a woman's place. And this growing discomfort was about to curdle into something truly sinister. The same qualities that made these women successful, their independence, their confidence, their intelligence, their refusal to conform, would soon be twisted into evidence of something far more dangerous in the connection between successful, independent women and the brutal, which Hans reveals the darkest chapter in our story. The flames crackled in the town square of Würzburg, Germany, on a cold morning in 1628. The woman being burned alive was named Anna Hansen. She was a successful businesswoman who had lived alone for over 20 years, accumulated a small fortune, and refused multiple marriage proposals. According to the trial records, her unnatural independence was cited as primary evidence of her pact with the devil. Anna's story was not unique. Between 1450 and 1750, an estimated 100,000 people were executed for witchcraft in Europe, and modern historical analysis of the trial records has revealed a terrifying pattern. A hugely disproportionate number of the accused women shared one crucial characteristic. They were economically independent and lived outside of direct male control. German historian Wolfgang Behringer's analysis of 16th century Bavarian, which trials found that single women were 12 times more likely to be accused than married women of the same age and social status. This was not random hysteria. This was a targeted campaign. The infamous witch-hunting manual, the Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487, reads like a paranoid manifesto against female independence. Literally wrote that women who live alone without male guidance are more susceptible to the devil because they lack the natural protection that submission to a husband provides. He argued that independent women were an affront to God's design. This was systematic terror designed to control female behavior, and it had a sinister economic motive. Analysis of confiscated property records shows that accused witches were often women of substantial means, whose assets were seized by the authorities upon their arrest. In some regions, the witch hunts were a profitable enterprise, funding everything from church renovations to the salaries of the persecutors themselves. The message sent to women was crystal clear: succeed too much, refuse marriage, and you might find yourself at the stake. The psychological warfare was brilliant in its cruelty. You didn't have to execute every independent woman. You just had to execute enough to make the others afraid. Contemporary documents show successful businesswomen hastily arranging marriages, selling their businesses, or retreating into convents, anything to avoid the fatal appearance of independence. The very traits that had made women successful were criminalized. Confidence was reinterpreted as arrogance. Business acumen became proof of supernatural aid. Intelligence was twisted into dangerous cunning. The trial of Agnes Waterhouse in England in 1566 is a perfect example. The evidence against her included: she lived alone after her husband's death. She maintained her own household without male help. She was known to be unusually clever with numbers, and neighbors testified that she seemed remarkably content for a woman without a husband. These were not crimes. They were achievements that had been redefined as sins. The witch hunts effectively destroyed centuries of progress in female economic independence. But even in the face of this terror, some women refused to be cowed. Court records tell stories of women who maintained their independence despite the risks, who supported accused neighbors despite the danger, and who quietly passed down the knowledge that female autonomy was both possible and worthwhile. The witch hunts eventually faded, but their psychological legacy lingered for centuries, embedding a deep-seated fear of female power into European culture. The stories of successful independent medieval women were so thoroughly erased precisely because their existence challenged a narrative that women needed male protection to survive and thrive. Their success proved that female dependence was a social construct, not a biological necessity, and that truth was too dangerous to be allowed to survive. But fire and torture weren't the only weapons. A more insidious campaign was being waged in the language itself, a war of words designed to shame independent women. The words we still use today carry the scars of that linguistic warfare. The word spinster. In the 14th century, it was a respectable occupational title, simply meaning a woman who spins thread for a living. But by the 1600s, it had become the official legal term for any unmarried woman over the age of 23. By the 1700s, it had acquired its modern negative connotation: a woman left on the shelf, a failure. Compare that to the word bachelor. It comes from a medieval term meaning a young knight or apprentice, words that suggest potential and promise. While spinster became an insult, bachelor retained its positive associations of freedom and choice. This was no accident. It was deliberate social engineering. Legal documents from the period reveal this stark double standard. An unmarried woman was a spinster, a term dripping with pity. An unmarried man of the same age was a bachelor, or simply a merchant. Same status, completely different linguistic framing. A 1581 legal manual defined a spinster as a woman who hath lived unmarried beyond the customary time, while a bachelor was a man who chooses to remain unmarried for his own purposes. Women failed to marry, men chose not to. The psychological impact was devastating. Women began to internalize the shame. They started their sentences with phrases like, "Though I remain a spinster through no fault of my own." The very language they used to describe themselves was laced with apology. This linguistic warfare created a world where the same behavior, prioritizing financial security before marriage, was praised in men and condemned in women. But even as society was rewriting the dictionary to control them, some of the most powerful women in medieval Europe were thriving behind convent walls. These weren't places of retreat for rejected spinsters. They were the executive suites of the medieval world, the only institutions where brilliant women could rise to positions of immense power without a man's permission. Meet Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century German abbess who was a true Renaissance woman centuries before the Renaissance. She wasn't just running a convent, she was running an intellectual empire. She composed symphonies that are still performed today. She wrote medical texts that were used for centuries. She corresponded with emperors and popes as their equal, and she was a brilliant businesswoman. Under her leadership, her abbey's wealth increased by 400%. These abbesses had powers that even kings envied. Some could mint their own money, hold their own courts, and even maintain their own armies. The Abbey of Quedlinburg in Germany was ruled by abbesses who held the rank of imperial princess and had a vote in the imperial diet. They had more political power than most male nobles. The economic scale of their operations was staggering. Shaftesbury Abbey in England, led by a succession of powerful abbesses, was the second wealthiest landowner in the entire country, surpassed only by the king himself. These women had discovered the perfect loophole in medieval misogyny. By framing their ambition in religious terms, they could achieve everything that was forbidden to their secular sisters. While the outside world was burning independent women as witches, these abbesses were accumulating more wealth, power, and influence than most kings. They had discovered that economic independence was the key. Their convents were run like multinational corporations, with diversified investments in land, banking, and trade. They proved, beyond any doubt, that female leadership could be incredibly effective. A 13th century papal report found that female-led religious houses were 60% more likely to be debt-free and 40% more likely to be expanding their operations than male-led monasteries. Within the convent walls, female ambition and intelligence were not just accepted. They were celebrated as gifts from God. These women weren't just making the best of a bad situation. They had actively chosen a life of purpose, power, and fulfillment. Their stories reveal that the medieval world offered paths to female autonomy that have been almost completely forgotten, proving that with the right strategy, even the most rigid systems can be navigated and, sometimes, as we've seen, many remarkable medieval women chose independence. But what about those who wanted love and partnership, but refused to settle for a relationship that would diminish them? Their strategy for finding equal partners in an unequal world reveal that medieval romance was far more complex and strategic than any fairy tale. Imagine a personal ad from 1387, placed in the London Guild records by a woman named Thomasina, seeking gentlemen of good character for intellectual companionship and mutual respect. Must appreciate an independent lady who owns her own property, speaks 3 languages, and has strong opinions. Dowry negotiable, but autonomy non-negotiable. This wasn't fiction. The women with the most success in the medieval dating market were not the helpless damsels in distress. They were the wealthy widows and successful businesswomen who knew their own worth. They had cracked the code. The best relationships are partnerships between equals. A 13th century French merchant named Marietta de Molieres essentially invented speed dating. Tired of suitors who were more interested in her inheritance than her intellect, she established mercantile salons, gatherings where unmarried professionals could meet, discuss business, and evaluate each other as potential partners. Her system focused on what she called a courtship of equals. These women developed what we now call compatibility tests. The letters of 14th century businesswomen reveal her elaborate vetting process. She required suitors to demonstrate their financial management skills and, most importantly, their comfort with female authority. One hilarious letter describes her asking a suitor to manage her household accounts for a week to see if he could appreciate a woman's work without seeking to control it. They negotiated prenuptial agreements that would make a modern lawyer proud, specifying everything from business partnership terms to protections for their right to travel for trade. Their economic independence was their greatest leverage. They could afford to be choosy. As one 16th century Italian merchant wrote, "I have spent 15 years building my fortune and my reputation. Any man who seeks my hand must prove he will add to both, not subtract from either." They even had trial periods. Court records from Florence described courtship contracts, where a couple would live in neighboring properties for a year, collaborating on business ventures to test their compatibility before committing to marriage. They understood the difference between settling for companionship and holding out for a true partnership. They wanted love, but only if it came with respect, equality, and mutual growth. These women's stories, their triumphs and their tragedies, offer a profound and timeless lesson. They prove that there is no single path to a fulfilling life. They show that female happiness, success, and independence are not modern inventions, but timeless aspirations of the human spirit. Their legacy lives on in every woman today who starts her own business, who travels the world solo, who chooses her own path, and who insists on living a life defined not by society's expectations, but by her own values. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the hidden history of these incredible women. Their stories were almost lost to us, buried under centuries of deliberate silence. By bringing them into the light, we don't just learn about the past, we gain a new perspective on our present and our future. If these forgotten stories fascinate you as much as they do me, and you want to be part of uncovering more of them, please consider becoming part of our community. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments which of these remarkable women inspired you the most. Your engagement helps these stories reach more people and ensures that these medieval heroines will never be forgotten again. Until next time, remember that the most radical thing you can do is live a life that is truly your own,